Next, we're going to talk about returns to scale. And what returns to scale does, it allows us to look at how much are we putting in and how much are we getting out. And this deals more with the variable inputs than so much the fixed inputs. Because whenever we're talking about the fixed inputs, as we've already talked about, fixed inputs stay the same. They are not being adjusted, but rather you can adjust the variable inputs to determine the level of output. So whenever we talk about returns to scale, we have three different types. We have constant returns to scale, increasing returns to scale, and then decreasing returns to scale. And what this ultimately is going to do is it's going to begin to set up the production function that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this same chapter. So constant returns to scale is whenever you add it or you increase inputs by some proportion and you wind up having output increase by the same proportion. So what I mean by that is, let's say you increase inputs by 50%, and at the end of the day, you get a 50% increase in output. You've increased your inputs by some proportion of 50%, and you get the same proportion out. So that's going to be our constant returns to scale. Then you have increasing returns to scale. Increasing returns to scale is as inputs are increased by a proportion, output is increased by a greater proportion. So what I mean by that is, let's say you put 50% of inputs, or you increase inputs by 50%. But lo and behold, you get 75% of increase in output. So you put just 50% in, and you get a 75% increase on the output. So you're putting, as you increase the amount of inputs, the output increases by a greater proportion. Then you have decreasing returns to scale. Decreasing returns to scale is whenever you increase inputs by a proportion, but you get an output increases by less of a proportion. So you increase inputs by, say, 50%, but you only get a 25% increase in output. So constant, you get a 1-to-1 ratio, whereas, say, increasing, you get along the lines of a, say, a 1-to-2 ratio, where output is greater than input. And then on the decreasing returns to scale, you might get a 1-to-1/2 ratio, where output is, or input increases by a greater amount than output. So, increasing returns to scale signals growth. Whenever you have this increasing returns to scale, whenever you're in this range, it's saying, hey, we need to start using more inputs. Because if we can use 1 unit of input and get 2 units of output out, that is a very efficient aspect, and we need to keep increasing our returns to scale. Or we need to increase our size because we're capturing that increasing returns to scale. Because you get more out with less in. So this signals growth. Whenever you have firms in this increasing returns to scale, it often kind of gives a signal of not only should you grow, but the larger firms are going to begin to push the smaller firms out. Because of this increasing returns to scale, these larger firms become more efficient. It's saying that we're going to use less amount of inputs and get a lot more out of it. So efficiency is a ratio of output per unit of input. When you're in this increasing returns to scale, you might be getting 2 units of output for every 1 unit of input. So that means that your output is a lot more efficient, or each input is producing more units of output, meaning you're more efficient. This often leads to these larger firms becoming more efficient, more cost effective, and that often leads these smaller firms to be less cost effective, less competitive, and it winds up pushing them out. So whenever you're under this increasing returns to scale, you should increase in your firm or grow your firm to capture more efficiency, and as you become larger, you wind up pushing these smaller firms out. Then you hit this constant returns to scale, and you see it's kind of a flowing motion. Usually what happens is, as you increase your inputs, you face this increasing returns to scale in the beginning. Then eventually you hit this constant returns to scale, and as you increase your input even more, you hit this decreasing returns to scale, which is something that might become a little more evident to you during the production function video. But whenever you're facing these constant returns to scale, this is where often large and small firms can coexist, or large or different size firms can coexist. In the U.S. and within the agriculture, we often see large and medium-sized firms, large and medium-sized farms coexist without ever really getting in each other's way. That's because they're in this constant returns to scale phase. That is a relatively large area in the agricultural field in the United States ag. So large and medium firms can actually coexist under this constant returns to scale. But we also see smaller firms fail because they're not in that constant returns to scale sector yet. So this constant returns to scale, whenever you're in that sector, it allows different sized firms to often coexist, especially in the United States agricultural field.